We're up to Daf Yud Tes, and we're learning about the Sul Shchita, which is called Hagroma. Hagroma means when he slants the knife out and it cuts outside of the parameters of where he has to do the Shchita in the Kana. The Kana is the trachea. And the Gemara here says, V'hilchasa, the final halacha is Mishipui Kova Ulamata Kshera. Now keep in mind that the Shipui Kova is higher up than the area of the Tabas Hagdola, which is where the Shchita should be done. And yet, nevertheless, the Gemara comes to the final conclusion that anywhere even above the Tabas, as long as it's below the Shipui Kova, and the Shipui Kova is sort of on one side of the trachea, whereas the Tabas is on the other side. And really, he should be shechting here on the Kova, on the Tabas, but at some point he slanted his shchita upwards, like towards the head of the animal, and he reached just below the Kova. As long as he reaches below the Kova, then the shchita is kosher. V'hainu deshir bechiti. So the chiti are above the Kova, but yet below the Shipui HaKova. Rav Nachman Achsher Mishipui Kova Olamata, so that just as we saw in the final ruling, Rav Nachman accepted that ruling and validated a shchita with a hagrama that came a little bit below the Shipui Kova. Amalei Rav Chanan bar Rav Katina Rav Nachman Keman Lo Karabana v'Lo Karab Yossi bar Yehuda. We had the Chumrah in our Mishnah of the Tanakama, the Kula of Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, but even Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda didn't go as far as to validate a shchita that reaches right below the Shipui Kova. That far he didn't go. According to Rabbi Yossi, the higher limit for shchita is the top of the tabas, but not beyond that. And now you, Rav Nachman, are paskening even beyond that. Omar, and Rav Nachman's response, he uses a kind of a phrase that appears in the Talmud, which is like a brush-off kind of parochial phrase. I know lo chilek yadan lo bilek yadan. I don't know chilek, I don't know bilek, meaning I don't know what you're talking about. Meaning, forget about the two opinions that are quoted in the Mishnah. I know shmaita yadana. I have teachings that I received from my Rebbeim, who are Amoroim, after the Mishnah, and I rely on those teachings. The Omer Rabbi Chia bar Abba Rabbi Yochanan, v'amri le Omer Rabbi Yochanan, mishipui kova lamata kshera. So I have a tradition from my Rebbeim that even if you go above, after the knife slants above the tabas, and it reaches the chiti, but it falls short of reaching the kova of the shipui of the kova, then it's valid. It's a good shchita. The Omer Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, mugremes derabanan ksheira Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda ksheira Rabbi Chanina ben Antignos. So that even though in the Mishnah we have the Chumrah of the Rabbanon, on top of that we have the Kula of Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, but there's a shita that's even more makil and more lenient than Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, and that's the shita of Rabbi Chanina ben Antignos. And we're going to paskin like Rabbi Chanina ben Antignos. Now, in the actual language of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, he doesn't seem to, he doesn't seem to say, well, we paskin like Rabbi Chanina, but the Gemara is going to ask Pshita, so what is he doing? He's just summarizing the three shitos. We know the three shitos. Mal detem, I would have thought that Rabbi Chanina ben Antignos adara bonan koi. How do you know that Rabbi Chanina ben Antignos, who appears right after the shitas Rabbanon, how do you know that he is going beyond the shita of Rabbi Yossi? Maybe he's just going beyond the shita of the Rabbanon, accepting the shita of Rabbi Yossi. And for that, Kamashmal, that's what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi wants to tell me, that Rabbi Chanina ben Antignos went a step further than Rabbi Yossi, and he was more lenient, allowing for a shchita with agrama that reaches beyond the chiti, but doesn't reach all the way up to the shipui kova. So Gemara asks, it does seem when you read Rabbi Chanina that he's really maybe relating to the Rabbanon. So how do you know, in fact, he's a third shita going beyond Rabbi Yossi? And Cain, the language of the Brisa says, Hayed Aleha mi it should have said Hayed Aleha mi boile. Aleha means about it. And instead of Aleha, which would have referred back to the shchita that the Chachamim spoke about, the Brisa should have read that Aleha Kshera, and that's not what it says. And Hilchas, so the final conclusion of the sugya is Rabbi Chanina ben Antignos to Koi Rav Nachman Kavosei. So Rav Nachman accepted Rabbi Chanina ben Antignos, which is the most lenient of all the three shitos. Okay, now we're going to embark upon a very lumdishus sugya, and we'll see what this is just a daf yomi shir, but we'll see what we can say about it. Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav Asi. Machlokes, the whole issue about hagrama, in which you cut outside the area of shchita in the kana, b'sheshachat shnei shlish vehigrim shlish. In other words, the first 2/3 of the trachea were slaughtered in the proper way. And then he veers off on the third third and completes the shchita b'agrama, whatever the shitas are of hagrama. And, says Rav Huna, the Rabbanon are going to look at the entire act of shchita. They're not going to freeze it midway or 2/3 of the way and say, well, he shechted properly and he brought about, the death of the animal. And as we're going to soon see, the death of the animal means when you go beyond 50% of the trachea, you cut 51%, that's already when the animal dies. So he did that properly, and who cares what he does later, which is going to be Rabbi Yossi Shita. But the Chachamim say we do care what he does later. The Rabbanan Savri, Kula Shchita Be'ina V'Tabas Kedol. We're going to look at the entire Shchita, and the entire Shchita has to be in the right place. And if you mess up after you did 2/3, which logically, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Sova, Ruba, Kukula, you did enough, and let's say you stopped after 2/3, just lifted up your knife in the air, then everything would have been fine, because you did the rov of the shchita, and that's it. So Rabbi Yehuda is going to argue that if you did rov of the shchita shnei shlish in the tabas, that's it. Ball game over. I don't care what you did later. I don't care if you stood on your head. Wouldn't make a bit of a difference. But the Rabbanan are going to look at the shchita from the beginning to the end as one continuous entity. And therefore, if you messed up on the third, then that's hagrom and that passes the shchita. But according to Rabbi Yossi, avol higrim shlish v'shachat shnei shlish. What happens if he starts the shchita with hagroma, let's say above the shipui kova, and even though he did most of the shchita following that first third, bekashrus in the right place in the tabas hagadola, but nevertheless, divrei hakol psula, even Rabbi Yossi is going to concede that the shchita is not valid. Why? The key point, it's like in a race, when you win the race, you got to pass a certain point. The key point is when it reaches the point in which the animal dies. And anything that came beyond that, before that point, has to be rove. So if you start the shchita in the right place, then when you get to 51% of the trachea severed, and that's the point at which the animal dies, you have done rove of the shchita, and that's fine. But if you started with a shlish of hagroma outside of the designated area for shchita, like for example the shipui kova, then what happens is that from 1/3 to 1/2, which is the valid part of his shchita, he brings about the death of the animal. But that's less than rove of the shchita. So you need that the rove of the shchita, in the case where he starts the shchita in the right place and he reaches 51%, that's kosher. And then Rabbi Yossi Agli says, I don't give a hoot what happens after the 51%. But if you started with hagroma, then you will not have rove of the shchita simon hakana when the animal dies. And Rav Chisda disagrees. Omalei Rav Chisda, Adarabba. What we say in Yiddish, Punkfaker. Lema mar ipcha. I would turn it over inside out. You're saying that everybody would agree in the case where he started ba'agroma. I would say the opposite. Machlokes kshehigrim shlish v'shachat shnei shlish. Even though he started the shchita ba'agroma outside of the area of the shchita, and he shechted already a shlish, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi still is going to hold that it's a kosher shchita savar midi dahavi achatzi kana pagu. The halacha is, and this is going to be a sugya later on, I think he tells you to find it on Daf Chav Ches, that if the animal had already a hole in its trachea, but it wasn't a treifa, then you could shecht from that hole and on. So let's say the animal had a hole that reached 50% of the trachea. It's still alive, the animal, and it'll live. Then if he puts the knife into the area of the hole and he finishes the shchita, it's kosher. That's the sugya later on. So here, when he starts with hagrama, consider it like a hole, a natural hole, in a damaged trachea. In which case, we know for sure that it's kosher when he finishes the shchita. For Rabbanan, on the other hand, the Rabbanan are machmir, because hasa makom shchita, hacha lav makom shchita. In the case where the animal already had a damaged trachea, and there was a big hole in the trachea, his shchita was in the right place, the right area designated for shchita, namely in the tabas. But in your case, where he started with hagrama, that's worse than this case where there was a hole. Because if it was a hole, that's not part of your shchita. So whatever you did in the shchita, you did properly in the right location. But in your case, he started the shchita in a shlish of hagrama outside of the designated area. So that's half of what Rav Chisda is going to say. And he's going to claim that the machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chacham is in a case where he started a shlish with Hagrama. Now we have the second half of Rav Chisda. Avol shochat shnei shlish vehigrim shlish. What happens if he did 2/3 of the shechita from beginning till 2/3? He did in the right place, and then afterwards he messed up and he slanted the last third of the shechita to the let's say shipui kova. Is divrei hakol kshera the tanan ruba shalecha kamo? I don't have a problem in assuming that the Rabbanu would agree to Rav Yossi in the case where he did 2/3 of the shechita in the right place, because once again, the logic, as we keep saying it over and over again, is that who cares what happens after the 2/3? The animal's already dead. He did a kosher shechita of 2/3 in the right place, and even the Rabbanu would agree that it's kosher. However, Rav Yosef is now going to attack Rav Chisda and the logic of Rav Chisda. Man nemelantahu ruba de hasam. Lav Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda Ketanivla. If I'm going to go with the original approach of who was it, Rav Huna, I'm going to tell you that Mishnah later on in Daf Chav Ches. I just want to double check if it's a Mishnah. No, it's a brisa later on in Daf Chav Ches that says you could pick up the shechita from the hole and on. That's Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. He's the one who allows, as long as you did the majority of the shechita in the right place, that's fine. So therefore, there was a hole, and let's say it reached 49% of the trachea. Now you can finish the shechita and do 51%. So therefore, Rav Yosef is saying to Rav Chisda, don't build your argument based on the brisa later on Chav Ches, because that brisa is really reflective of the shita of Rav Yosef, Rav Yehuda. Amalei Abai goes back against Rav Yosef to really defend Rav Chisda. Atu kol rubi di alma Rav Yosef, Rav Yehuda katanila. Are you going to assume that wherever you find a brisa, a Mishnah brisa that says rubo kakulo, that rov is enough? That's going to be attributed to Rav Yossi, Rav Yehuda. I mean, after all, the Rabbanan agreed that rubo kakulo. They just worry about the last part of the shechita that was out of its place. Amalei, Rav Yosef responds to Abaye. It's back and forth. Ano ruba the shechita kamina the shamelal depligi. Right, we have a machlok between the Rabbanan and Rav Yossi, Rav Yehuda, with regard to rubo kakulo of the shechita, and therefore, whenever I see the issue of rov, like for example, where there was a hole in the trachea and then the shochet picked it up from the hole and on, I'm going to assume that that's Rav Yossi, Rav Yehuda. Lishnachrina, the Gemara now has a different record or transmission of the Shakla V'Tari, the back and forth. Amrile, it says in this version, Omer of Huna, Omer of Asi. A different transmission of Rav Huna, and that is Machlokes Kshehigrim Shlish V'Shochat Shnei Shlish. What happens now? He starts with a Hagrama, and he cuts at the Shipui Hakova, 1/3. Now, according to Chachamim, that we're going to look at the entire shechita, he already blew it because he started with Hagrama outside of its area. But Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda, Chatzi Kana Pagum. Rabbi Yossi is the one who compares it to the Chatzi Kana Pagum, which means that the first part of the shechita was not his at all. The animal had a hole in its trachea. And yet we validate the shechita. For Rabbanan Savri, no, they say Hasam Makom shechita. There, the shechita that he did from the hole and on was in the right designated area for shechita. Hachalav Makom shechita. But here he did a shlish ba'agrama at the top part here of the trachea, and that's outside of the area, and therefore, Aval Shochat Shnei Shlish V'Gem Shlish is Divrei Kol Kshera, but says Rav Huna in the second Lishna, that if he started with a proper shechit and he did Shnei Shlish, then even the Rabbanan are going to agree that once he does Shnei Shlish in the proper place, the shechit is geendik. It's fine. It reaches reached the final goal line, and it's kosher. We don't care afterwards. Asnan Ruba Shalecha Kamo. And again, we're going back to the Shaklavitaria here between Rav Huna and Rav Chizda in the second Lishna. Maskif la Rav Chizda. Man lemalanta huru b'dahasam. Lav Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, Dilma Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, Ketani. So that entire halacha that you can start from the damaged area in the trachea and continue the shechita, or begin and end the shechita from there, and that's kosher, that's only according to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. But according to Rav Chizda, the Rabbanan would never allow for such a thing because you didn't do rov of the simon. The shechita has to be the majority of the simon, and that you don't have. But Amalei Rav Yosef, again, we're going back to the Shaklavitari according to the second transmission. Atu kol ruba de alma Rav Yosef Rav Yudah Katani le Amalei ano ruba de shchita kamina de shamalei de pligi. Okay, now let's talk about the following case: Higrim shlish, v'shachat shlish, v'higrim shlish. Now, if you're following the logic of the sugya here, he started with a shlish of hagroma, he ends with another shlish of hagroma, and in the middle he's got a shlish in the right location. In that case, rov of the shchita was bahagroma outside of its location. And intuitively, I would have said it's possible. Or no, maybe we should offer a different logic, and that is the animal died at that half of shchita, right, 50% and on, let's call it 51%, and that part of the shchita he did in the right place. That's enough for shchita. So Rav Huna Amar Rav Ksher, Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Treifa, the two different transmissions in the name of Rav. Rav Huna Amar Rav Ksher ki nafka chiyusa b'shchita ka nafka. Even though only one shlish of his shchita was in the proper place, but nevertheless, that's the key of keys. That takes you over the goal line, because that's when he caused the death of the animal at 51%. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav Treifa be'ina ruba v'shchita v'leka. We need a rove of the simon, in this case the kana, to have been shechted, and he didn't shechted rove, because two shlish, the first and the third, were outside the parameters of shchita. Okay, so that was a case where he started with hagroma of a shlish, and he ended with hagroma shlish. Now we have a different case. The exact opposite. Shachat shlish, so the first and the third thirds were in the proper place. Higrim shlish, but the middle third was outside of the parameters on the Shipra Kova, v'shachat shlish. Now let's just think about this. In this funny case, he did rov shchita in the right place, but carrying it over the goal line, meaning the death of the animal, was not done through shchita, it was done through agrama. So then the question is it enough that he does rov in the right place? Or do we say no? The key of keys is that crossroads. I don't know what word I'm looking for, but anyway, that mavar. When you go from life to death. Rabbi Yehuda Rav Ksher. But Asu Shayla Rav Huna Amalu Treifa. Now this is very strange because this is the same Rav Huna who before said Ksher. But in any event, what we see here is machlokas as to whether or not rov shchita in the right place is enough, or the key of keys is that middle shlish, when he takes the animal over the Malach HaMavis's line. Shom Rabbi Yehuda Ikpid. Now, keep in mind that it says that they asked a question to Rav Huna, and Rav Huna said it was treif. So Rav Yehuda is not going to be happy, a happy camper, Omar. Every time I issue a ruling, you disagree with me. Omar Tarif no machshir. When I said it was treif, you said it's kosher. When I said it was kosher, you said it was treif. Omar Rav Huna, shaper mikpad. So Rav Huna now bows in humility, and he says, you were right. I have to rescind my position. First of all, Rabbi Yehuda was a direct Talmud, and he heard it straight from Rav. But no, lo shmile. I'm only quoting it in the name of a tradition in the name of Rav. V'od, and furthermore, ha'ika ruba b'shchita. Right, in this case, when Rav Huna, paskin that it's treif, he started with a proper shchita of a shlish, ended with a proper shchita of a shlish. He has 2/3 of a shchita, which is kosher, and therefore we should go basaro. The middle shlish was ba'agroma. That doesn't bother. Amalei Rav Chizda. Rav Chizda now wants to give chizuk to Rav Huna and says, Lo te'edabach. There's no need for you to rescind your position. And when you said it was treifa, because the middle shlish was bagroma, you were right.